thank you very much, Charles Esche, to participate in this interview. I would like you to present the Jakarta Biennale and to give us some insights and even share some thoughts about what is going to be. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was invited about a year ago now to do the Jakarta Biennale, which will open on the 14th of November and run until January. And I've known the situation in Indonesia for some time. I first went there in 2001. So I have some sort of sense of the way that whole art situation and also economically and politically the country has developed, particularly since the overthrow of Suharto in 1998. And it seemed to me one of the important things was to look at the responsibility of an international curator in those situations. So structurally, we made a commitment to put together a group of emerging curators, which is now 6-7 people. And basically, I would take them through the process of making a biennale with me, but also leave a lot of the decisions on the artists, not even exactly up to them, but in discussion, in an equal discussion. So that I would have one voice amongst the whole group of people, and we would be able to discuss artists, particularly artists from Indonesia and from the wider Southeast Asia region, but also internationally, as a group of people that are thinking what it would mean to bring them to Jakarta, what it would mean to bring them to invite them to make new work in this situation. So that's how the structure started, and we picked up quite rapidly some sort of important fundamental aspects of what is going on in Jakarta and why it might be interesting to focus on certain questions. And one of the questions was water, was the issue of flooding, also the issue of water quality, how people are using water, which obviously touches on many things. It touches on the environment and on questions of how we exploit the environment. And it touches on questions of what city development is and urban development. And how you make sense of that as an artist, how you make sense of your environment if you live there or if you come from outside, how you make sense of a city, of the kind of scale and the dimension of Jakarta, which is the reality for a huge percentage of the world's population living in cities from São Paulo to Shanghai, which are polluted, which either have too much water or too little water, but never quite enough, or that for whom the environment is becoming increasingly hostile, in order to live there, and yet more and more people still can't. So this question of Jakarta became something that was interesting for me to experience from the point of view of the curators and also of the artists. And then wider than Jakarta, the question of Indonesia and its relationship to the environment is, I think, one that's very interesting. The way it's being exploited by big multinational corporations, the development of palm oil plantations, for instance, and the kind of exploitation of local knowledge that is going on, the movement of populations. It's very, very brutal. We see in a place like Indonesia, you see the brutality of the global capitalist system that we have at the moment. And so that's interesting to bring into the picture, and also in relationship to that and other questions around identity in Indonesia, we came to the second topic. So the first topic is water in general. The second topic is history. So how do we use history today? So really bringing in, from my point of view, a kind of Benjaminian analysis of history, like what history do we need for the present, into the Indonesian situation. And we decided it was interesting to look at the 80s, particularly in Indonesia, because it had been less explored. And the 80s is an interesting decade. It's falling into history. It's moving beyond living memory to a certain extent, at least for the majority of the population. And it's also moving into a history where the stories of the 80s will become fixed quite soon. It will become a historical period. It will move to being an antiquity kind of thing rather than contemporary history. And so it's still on that edge between being something that that has for people of my age and beyond more or less a lived experience. It was contemporary, and for the majority of people in the world who are younger than me, it's actually something that's already finished, and it's part of their genealogy. It's part of how they came and how we came as a society to where we are. So the 80s seemed to be interesting to investigate in Indonesia, but also it went wider to looking at how the histories of Indonesia from the colonial period onwards through the Japanese occupation, the Dutch occupation, and then independence, and then the histories of Sukarno and Suharto, how those affect the current situation, and how those might be useful for us today. And then the third one was the position of women, that again sort of unfolded from the history question. So if you imagine we started with water, and then in order to understand water, you need to understand something of history. And in order to understand why history played out in the way, you need to understand the role and relationships with women, in particularly in Indonesian society. And of course, all these questions, feminism, women, history, water, they all have international repercussions. They all have equivalents, parallels in different parts of the world elsewhere. And so that's basically how we then started to bring the artists together.
How this will be reflected into the biennial visually also.
So visually, we have one big, huge, actually, 2,000 square meter warehouse space, more or less in an accessible part of Jakarta. And into that, we're going to build a kind of urban footprint. Villages in Indonesia are called kampungs, and there are many urban kampungs. So these sort of urban villages in the middle that are quite low rise, often built in quite difficult land, which is subject to flooding, for instance. Quite poor in relationship to certain parts of Jakarta that are for the elite and have much better infrastructure, but that have their own self-build construction behind it. You see this in many cities, these kind of self-build areas of the city. But the kampung also relates to the old village identity of rural Indonesia as well. So it's like the urban village, somehow we can see it, but also like the favela. It's related to both of these traditions. And so we're actually going to, in a way, build our own very small mini kampungs in this huge warehouse space. And each of the kampung will have some degree of focus on water, on history, on the question of women and the feminist history of Indonesia, then supplemented by international stories. So you imagine that the focus is on the Indonesian question in general, and on Jakarta. So about 60%, 65% of the artists will be Indonesian, and then international artists will make some projects in Indonesia, and then we'll have some examples of work from outside of Indonesia entirely. So there'll be kind of three levels that will grow from the local to the planetary.
How did the research behind the biennial grow?
Well, it grew. The group that we have working on this, the curatorial group, obviously has their own network. And it's important to say that group comes from all over Indonesia. So not only from Jakarta, but also from Makassar, from Sulawesi, from Sumatra, from Banda Aceh, and from different parts of Java. So, of course, Indonesia is a huge, huge country. It's bigger than the United States of America or something like that. But in a way, we have more diversity represented than is usual in the situation. And I'm quite interested to see the different positions and different histories and different networks that each of these young curators brings to the party. So in a sense, the research has been in their hands and then in their network. I myself, I've traveled a little bit. So I've been to some of the cities that the curators are from. And there we've been talking to people in the university, students who are studying about the local situation. So some of the research has been done collectively, but some of it has been done by these individuals. And it's been located in the various cities. So therefore, some projects will happen actually outside Jakarta entirely, in Surabaya or in Makassar.
What is the main difference between this biennial and the other biennials you have curated and also, and this is a big question, between curating a biennial and curating an exhibition in a museum. So what is the role of the exhibition and of the biennial, institutionally speaking?
I think it's a good question to ask about the relationship between this biennial and other biennials, because I've recently done São Paulo Bienal and obviously some in the past in Palestine and in Istanbul. And I think that the core difference for me is that I'm much more having a role as a mentor almost, as somebody who's guiding a group of younger curators through the process and trying to use whatever knowledge or whatever experience I have to help them through that process. But I don't know the artists in the same way that I knew them, for instance, for Sao Paulo or for Ramallah or something like that. In that it's being slightly at one remove, which is in a way very interesting because it means that I'm getting to know the artworks through the curators. But also it means that I have a different role because it's not necessarily about working directly with the artist so much as seeing whether we can make a coherent story overall of bringing these three elements which seemed important in our research and in our discussions of water, history and feminism, bringing these three together in something which will make sense for a public, for the users of the Biennale. And that's quite different from other roles that I've had in Biennales, I think. This mentoring role is something that's new, and I quite enjoy it, I have to say. It's quite nice. The difference with a museum is, of course, I think with the Biennale, you're very location dependent in a way that a museum is less so. Yeah, so I wouldn't want to do every project in Eindhoven about Eindhoven. I don't think that would be adequate. And I think if you were in a museum in Jakarta, you wouldn't want to do every project about Jakarta either. So you have to, you really have a different set of questions. I think also Biennales are allowed to understand that the aesthetics of their choices are related to ethics. Ethics of funding. We had many issues in Sao Paulo and things like that around these questions of getting the money from the oligarch class and diverting it in a way to other activities which the oligarch class felt very unhappy about. And that process, I think, of the ethics of Biennales is something that I'm interested in. The ethics of museums, of course, to some extent the same, but we still have this luxury, I suppose, of the collapsed social democratic system in a country like the Netherlands, which still survives sufficiently that most of our money comes through taxation, so comes through an idea of public accountability rather than being dependent upon the oligarch class. That's not going to last very much longer, and I think that the ethics of Brazil will come to the Netherlands rather than the other way around, relatively soon. But at the moment, the discussions feel very different around the relation between aesthetics and ethics in a situation like Sao Paulo. In Jakarta, we actually have mostly public money because there isn't so much private money, or the private money is spent outside of a forum like the Biennale. And that actually makes it ethically much easier, and also the kind of things that we're doing, we wouldn't have been able to do in Sao Paulo for sure.
What do you think? Because I hope has to. I mean, in the last interviews, I've asked you a lot of persons, a lot of your fellows also. What is the museum of the future? And I would like to ask you, what is the biennial of the future? How it is gonna change in the next future? The way we conceive biennials, the way we go to biennials, the way we curate biennials also.
Yeah, I mean, if we talk about the future, it's hard to see a future because of the climate crisis. No, I mean, I don't. I think we're at a point where things are fundamentally going to change. So I think the idea of an international Biennale is itself the fact that I get a flight to Jakarta is probably not going to be possible within 10 years. Not for the same cost, and not considering the kinds of damage that's doing to the environment. And of course, that's difficult to explain to myself, and certainly difficult to explain to my son in a certain way. Yeah? The kind of irresponsibility that involves. So I don't see it as being sustainable. I mean, what we're doing at the moment is not simply going to roll on. Like modernity itself is grinding to a halt. Yeah, where I think Immanuel Wallerstein said we're the last but one crisis. We just lived through the last but one crisis. And the last crisis will be when the nation state goes bankrupt. So now we had the banks being bankrupt, and now in Greece, for instance, you see that once the nation state is bankrupt, then it stops functioning entirely, and we have to build another system. So I think that's the future. So I don't think there is a future for biennales in that sense. There's clearly, the worst, the dystopian future, the apocalyptic future, is the future, I suppose, sort of sketched out to some extent in Brazil. A future of a small elite which completely protects themselves. I mean, it's in the Hunger Games. That's the future. And I'm sure for that elite there will be a role for museums. Probably privately funded, probably closed more or less to that mass of the public. But this huge division between a small elite, which continues more or less the civilizational discourse of the Enlightenment, believed itself to be still connected to that, and a huge underclass which exists completely removed from that. That maybe is going back to the 19th, 18th, or even to a sort of medieval social division. You could make relationships between that, but of course, because we've been through our modern history through democratic and revolutionary politics, it will appear much worse than it did before that happened, because the notion of progress or of democracy doesn't look to be too much in prospect in that apocalyptic version of the future. I think there's another version of the future which I think certain artists and institutions can sketch out, which is to try and build a common future. To try and understand that elite is actually the thing that's damaging. And while we might have to accept quite dramatic drops in our levels of income, I think that public museums and public space and common endeavor and common capacity are the things that we have to build on. And clearly the future of the museum might be to transform itself into that place where the common in general can be expressed, where people can come together and can meet, which can be inclusive of different narratives, where the curators in a sense become facilitators much more. Where the museum would have its general position in favor of the commons, in favor of public ownership, in favor of shared histories, in favor of narratives that are inclusive, but would allow those narratives and those histories to be determined by other people, not only by itself, and would try and take a distance from the elite. That would be the optimistic future, I think. It would still mean a reduction in the kind of resources that we had, but it would mean trying to retain a notion of society that was not this completely divided Hunger Games version of society.
Thank you very much for your sharing your point of view and giving us some answers.